Liz never regretted trading her family for science. And how did she do that? That's what people said. She was sure that both could be perfectly combined, just that her life's work had to come first. Because the family, if you make a step aside, let go, so to speak, the reins, it will not go anywhere from you, but science. Just dare to be not diligent enough of its student and faithful adherent, but just dare. You'll find yourself on the margins. No, Liz had never regretted that her calling had come first. Not until a sudden severe illness had turned her whole world upside down. And now she wondered if it was her own fault that her family treated her so badly. Maybe she should have given more love? Although, she did love. And did she really deserve everything that was happening to her? Liz Tyler had been born into a special kind of family, where whatever generation she came from, whatever branch of the family, they would all be intelligent people. The cream of the crop, so to speak. In any case, it had been so since the end of the 18th century and up to the 20s of the 20th century. And then, in connection with the well-known historical events, much of course changed. The family thinned out. The family was scattered all over the world. Then, however, by the 60s, many things seemed to have been restored to the Tyler family, including a solid position in society, accumulation of all sorts of benefits. But still Liz remembered the words of her grandfather, who said that before, much earlier, everything was different. Liz's peers were not the same, in the sense that they didn't want to obey their elders and continue the family business. They invented all sorts of things. No, look at this. Liz's grandfather Elliot once resented, "How can you become a cook when I told you to be an archaeologist? Maybe you'll rediscover Babylon." And no cake for my anniversary. This bastard will not bribe me. That's how Elliot felt about his son, Uncle Liz. But then, by the way, he graciously forgave him and even admitted that he'd never eaten a cake as delicious as the one his son had made. But still, those were the days when not many people in the Tyler family were doing the great things of the past. Except that Liz was, as Elliot said, completely of their breed. Because she knew from childhood that she was going to be a historian. And she chose a difficult direction, the early Middle Ages in Europe, in its northern regions, with a special focus on folk culture, mythology, tales of that era. Liz remembered that day as if she were running along the path of their cottage, past the tall pines, to the brick house, which from afar looked like a fairy tale castle, so skillfully built was its roof with decorative turrets. This cottage, by the way, was not kept by relatives to whom it was inherited in the 90s, and some strangers sold it, and those even demolished it. They wanted to build their own. But it seems that they did not calculate the money, and then there was some small wooden house in this place. And on the place where there was a luxurious flower garden, once greenhouses were put and grew vegetables for sale. "Grandpa," shouts Liz and throws herself at the old man's neck. "I've passed my last exam. I'm done studying." Elliot laughs, and although he is many years old, it seems like 100, he hugs his granddaughter tightly and pulls her off the ground, spinning her around as if she were 5 years old, and laughs back. What a clever girl. Our breed. Now there will be someone to pass on Princess Pelagia's gold to. Oh, that gold of Princess Pelagia. Tyler's main family treasure. It was said that once it would have been enough for a whole chest. There were heavy bracelets, many rings, necklaces, headbands, braid clips, brooches, precious shoe buckles. But by the will of fate, sometimes unfavorable, by the 70s of the 20th century, when Liz Young just graduated from the university, only a small part of it remained. However, Liz knew it was the biggest treasure in their family, and she was its main heir. And this gold, by the way, was not meant to be worn and walked around in. No way. It was supposed to be always, forever. Must be kept in a tiered casket, a kind of fancy wooden chest on velvet beds. According to family tradition, something of this splendor could be worn only once and only by one person, the eldest daughter or the wife of the eldest son on their wedding day. That's all. And the rest of the time, please keep the family wealth as it should be, because this is not some bling. Elliot's beloved grandfather died when Liz was 27. She'd been sad for him for a long time. Because, well, she'd had a good relationship with her parents, but Grandpa was the only one she'd ever been really close to among the entire Tyler family. Parents, by the way, were suddenly the people who wanted to sell the gold. You see, they wanted to buy a check-made wall in the hall, a German kitchen set, and also a car. My parents said that Grandpa was gone and therefore there was no point in following the bourgeois tradition. But Liz stood her ground. She declared that if they touched any of the set, she would no longer be their daughter. My parents were a little shocked. Mom cried and said that she had raised an egoist, dresser, and generally abnormal. Dad looked sternly, coldly, and said he didn't expect such a thing from his own daughter. Liz was both ashamed and... No, Liz was overcome by a thirst to preserve the memory of her grandfather and the family legacy. Liz had loved hearing the legend of how the gold had come into the family, and after that memorable fight with her parents, she had taken the box with it to herself. And all her life she kept it with her in a safe place. After graduation, Liz got a job as an assistant to a historian, Dan, a grandfather's acquaintance. Then, having gained experience and recognition, so to speak, in narrow circles, she began to teach at the university herself. She was known as a strict, ruthless teacher to her students. Liz did not want to get married. She was not interested in all this romantic fuss. But, still, youth took its toll, and at 32 she married Nick. Grandpa Elliot, by the way, this union would hardly approve. Because Nick had nothing to do with the intelligentsia and was a hereditary worker. But he understood Lisa in everything, respected her choice, and they lived soul to soul for exactly 20 years. Until the accident happened, Nick died at work. Just scaffolding construction once collapsed. Meanwhile, it was already the 90s. Liz was left practically alone with her daughter Christy in her arms. While her husband was alive, she had not seen her daughter, but could continue to do her science. The child was looked after by a nanny. Now there was no money for that. Liz was the sole breadwinner for her small family. And there were no relatives to help her. I mean, there were relatives, acquaintances, but... In fact, she had drifted away from them over the years. In fact, no one was ready to take care of someone else's family. Many people considered Liz strange, almost insane, and reproached her for being too morbidly interested in her history, too high-minded about all the people of more, so to speak, ordinary professions. Liz, having lost her husband, felt the loneliness of it all. But then, after some grieving, she pulled herself together. There was no time to lose heart. She had to write a book about the Viking trek along the Silk Road. Having managed to save money, Liz hired a nanny again and returned to her craft. Her daughter was growing up. And too late, Liz noticed and realized how far she was from her own child. The revelation came suddenly, just one day, on the eve of Christy's high school graduation. Liz had told her to be careful at the party, not to drink any of that stuff, and to go home early. "You should have raised me earlier," snapped at her daughter. "You were never around. What do you know about me? I'm going to be 18 in a month, and that's it. I'm leaving." "Where are you going?" Liz asked in shock. "Anywhere. As long as I get away from here," Christy said and left, slamming the door. She said she would never be such a disgusting mother to her children. Liz felt very strange at the time. She was both angry and offended at her daughter. She was indignant at her ingratitude. She was fed, clothed and clothed as well as anyone else. Should we go to the sea every year for a vacation? Obligatory. With tutors to study to get prospects through education? Absolutely. In general, what was missing? Was it that her mother didn't play dolls with her until she was 14? What the hell is wrong with that girl? Liz hoped that Christy would calm down, apologize, and they would get on with their lives. She also hoped that Christy would stop fooling around and go into a normal profession and become a historian, for example, or maybe a cultural historian, as was the norm in her family. Liz would also approve of such professions as sculptor, architect, restorer. But her daughter was once again unpleasantly surprised. By deciding to become an accountant, the fact that she had carried out her threat and left home to a neighboring town, where she had settled in a dormitory. Liz took offense at first, and then, well, she tried to get in touch. She sent her daughter money. It was well known that students needed it all the time. And slowly, as if they began to communicate a little better. But still, Christy made it clear that she had decided to live on her own, and without any respect almost didn't give a damn about the family heritage. "Who's going to carry on our business?" Liz asked. "What business of ours?" Christy replied with a wicked grin. What a dynasty. They had lived in their own world for generations, despising everyone around them, and what had they done? Do you know that you are considered crazy, like your grandfather Elliot? him and your great-grandfather. I don't care. What did he see in his life? Dusty books and shards of clay. He was talking nonsense. So Liz was left alone. Suddenly there were no people around. There was a job, though, a destiny, a vocation. And she honestly tried to go headlong into it. All the more so when, after all these years, Grandpa Elliot's diaries turned up. The thing was that they had been handed down from an old friend of his who had died, and his heirs had decided not to throw away such antiques, but to give them to the person to whom they had once belonged. Liz was very surprised by this because she didn't understand why her grandfather would keep his diaries with a stranger, albeit a friend, a colleague. But she took them for herself. As a memory, I looked into them, of course. Most of it was really diary stuff about the weather, the minutiae of life. There were funny stories about lazy students trying to sneak cheat sheets in or cheat on exams, memories of the journeys Elliot had made in his life, some fairy tales written down there. Liz, who had a lot of her own things to do when she returned to the diary family, didn't have time for all that, so she put them away. Meanwhile, time flew by. The daughter, having finished her studies and not thinking of coming back, she decided to settle down in that foreign city. And there she met a man. Liz went and came back in tears because Christy had chosen the wrong man. You see, he was a new businessman. And in Liz's opinion, he looked like a gangster. And he was almost 20 years older than Christy. He was divorced and had a child from a previous relationship. His son's name was Joffrey. All in all, it was hardly a marriage to be happy about. Liz had even hoped that her daughter would come to her senses and divorce. But it didn't happen. But she had children, first a girl, whom she named Maggie, and then a son, Sami. Maybe you should move to our town. One day on the phone, Liz suggested to her daughter, I'd be closer to my family. I could help with the grandchildren. Why, Mom, are you retired already? Christy asked. Would you give up your job to devote yourself to your grandchildren? What do you mean? Liz didn't understand. I was just thinking. Don't think. Christy laughed. What's the point of me living with you? To fill my children's heads with the same nonsense. You think I don't know that you can't help me? You couldn't raise your own daughter properly. What grandchildren for you? However, fate had it that Liz did get close to her daughter's family, but it didn't work out the way she wanted it to. Christy had called one day and asked in an unexpectedly pitiful, begging voice if she could come to town with her husband's son from his first marriage. The thing was that the boy was diagnosed with a rare disease, and in that small town where Christy lived, just did not have the right specialists. Well, come, of course. Everybody come. Liz rejoiced. That is, she was happy that her daughter was coming with her own grandchildren. And the arrival of that stranger's child, she wasn't happy at all. Christy arrived, taking up her room in the large 2-bedroom apartment where the Tylers had lived for decades. Liz did her best to make the guests feel welcome, putting the best stuff on the table, offering to show off the town to the guys. Except that neither Maggie nor Sami were particularly happy to see their grandmother. They did not look like loving grandchildren. They were capricious, ill-mannered, rude boys. Maggie, at 9, to Liz's horror, had no table manners at all, but she could swear foully and ugly. And Sami, who was 7, was always messing up all the things he could get his hands on. Joffrey, not her own grandson, was not the man Liz had expected him to be. He was a tall boy for his 12 years. He had blonde hair, glasses, and a nose full of freckles. He was quiet, polite, and silent. Unlike his brother and sister, he was the only one who said he would be happy if Grandma showed him the town. Liz shrugged and decided it wouldn't hurt her to take him somewhere. Shall we go to the park? She asked. Would you like to go on the rides? Could we go to the art gallery? Joffrey asked, and Liz opened her mouth. I didn't expect that. While her own grandchildren spent all their free time watching cartoons and silly shows on TV, this grandson read books and listened intently and thoughtfully to Liz's stories about the Tyler family. Sometimes it seemed to Liz that Joffrey was even more like their family's ancestors than Christy and her children. Liz was genuinely concerned about Joffrey's health problems, and when it became clear that he needed money for his medication, she withdrew the necessary amount from her bank account without question. And when it was time for Christy and the kids to go home, Liz saw them off with tears in her eyes and called them to come back. to come back again. Time flew on. Liz was now fully retired. Age was making itself felt. What used to seem like a simple ailment suddenly became a disease. And although Liz still had acquaintances in her circle, the same scientists, but they were all old, and after she left the university, after she stopped working, communication with them slowly came to naught. But what was surprising and frightening at the same time for Liz was that it was as if she didn't notice the passage of time. That is, she realized, of course, that another year had passed, another year, and so on, but this realization came on abruptly and painfully, as if the passage of time was also a kind of disease. And sometimes, especially in the evenings, it was almost physically unbearable for Liz to be alone in the big apartment. Then memories came back, about how nice it used to be here. Lots of family, guests, friends. And now? Books and cupboards, statues, paintings, everything the Tylers had saved up, preserved with great effort over decades of family history. Liz wondered more and more often who would get it all after she died. What would become of it all? As time slowly moved on. One day, everything finally and abruptly changed. It was at the end of winter, when it seemed there was no ice left on the street at all. But Liz's foot somehow found it, and the old woman fell awkwardly. The ambulance took her to the hospital, and the doctors determined it was a very compound fracture first, and a damaged back second. Liz, feeling helpless, lonely, called her daughter. Yes, a social worker visited her, but it was clearly not enough. And then Liz made up her mind. Christy has had many changes in her life over the years, by the way. She separated from her first husband and remarried, and in pursuit of her feminine happiness, she moved far away. What do you want? I can't just jump up and come to you, replied Christy to her mother. Maybe you need to go to some pension for the elderly? Christy said that she had no time and that she did not understand how a mother could be so irresponsible. After all, in the boarding house, at least care and supervision of her will be. But if she will sit alone in her apartment and something else happens to her, then how can she be? And then, a few days after this difficult conversation, Liz was contacted by Christy's children. Maggie called. The granddaughter seemed very disturbed by what had happened to her grandmother and said that here she was in person available and could come and live with her, look after her. Thank you, darling. Come on over, Liz replied. Maggie said she would buy the tickets as soon as she hung up the phone. She added that she'd come with Sami because he needed to see his grandmother too. And Joffrey should come too, said Liz. Maggie hesitated and said that, actually, Joffrey was busy at the moment he was studying. But then she agreed that yes, perhaps he should tell her what had happened. I don't understand you, though, Maggie added. Why? He's no one. Liz disagreed. She didn't think of Joffrey as a stranger. Even if they didn't see each other often, maybe once or twice a year, there was something about him that made him different from her grandchildren. Something that made her think of Elliot's grandfather. I mean, really, Liz had been looking at old photos recently and could have sworn that Joffrey and Elliot were practically the same face. Finally, the grandchildren had arrived. Liz was ready to forget all the misunderstandings they'd had in the past because now she didn't feel lonely again. Maggie quickly took matters into her own hands, asking how her health was doing. How was everything in general? After a few weeks, however, Liz also began to realize that things were not as smooth as they had seemed at first. For one thing, Maggie seemed to have little patience. No, she didn't insult her grandmother in a direct way, but she could give her a sharp answer and tell her not to bother her with silly conversations. Sami was almost never home at all, and when Liz tried to find out where her grandson was, Maggie replied that it was none of her business. The only person in whose company Liz felt truly comfortable was Joffrey. He was already 23 years old and was graduating from university, and he wanted to become a professional jeweler. It's a very good profession, Liz praised his choice once again. Our grandfather Elliot's great-grandfather's cousin was a jeweler. He even made jewelry for the English royal family. You're very capable, Joffrey. You'll do very well. Only Joffrey, by the way. Liz had shown the Tyler family treasure Princess Pelagia's gold more than once and more than twice. And only he willingly listened to the legend that told how they were created in the first place and how they got to the Tylers. Maggie and Sami, however, were also interested in gold, but purely for practical purposes. First of all, they asked what Grandma, she would bequeath them any of it, right? Liz was confused and replied confusedly that it went without saying that the jewelry would go to her relatives after her. "Why don't you sell them now?" Sami once asked, and his eyes ran strangely. "Why shouldn't the gold sit idle?" Liz gasped with indignation. How dare he call a centuries-old heritage just gold and say such a thing? At first, Liz thought that she would live much better in the company of her grandchildren, who had come to look after her while she recovered. But she soon realized that this was not the case. Somehow, very quickly, her pension was at the disposal of her grandchildren. And according to them, everything in the stores was terribly expensive, which is why her pension was running out so quickly. Liz, who used to buy everything herself before the grandchildren arrived, naturally wondered whether prices had risen so quickly. "Well, Grandma, what do you want?" Maggie shook her head. "And besides, we look after you here. We don't work, by the way. We live on our own money. Do you think it's easy?" What else was an old woman to do? She sighed and tried not to talk about money anymore, especially since there was still some savings in the account, so. "Joffrey, I want to give you power of attorney for the money," Liz said one day. "I don't want to say anything bad about your brother and sister. They're here. They're looking after me. They even took me to the clinic for scans. But only." Grandma Joffrey interrupted her. "I realize that maybe I'm wrong to say this. Just don't encourage that couple too much, okay?" And then Joffrey explained to the old lady what the matter was. And the point was that Maggie hadn't worked while she was living in her hometown. Yeah, she was a student. But then she was expelled for failing grades. And for a while she lived with her boyfriend, or rather with a man, a market trader, who was a good 10 years older than her. Then he kicked her out and Maggie went back to her father. Sami didn't go anywhere at all. It was like he was looking for himself. And Joffrey said that his half-brother had a bad habit of drinking, just like his father. How Liz gasped. "I've never seen him drunk." "He's clever," Joffrey explained. "He drinks beer in the evening when no one can see him. But if he's like his father, he won't stop there." "And you? Don't you drink?" Liz asked cautiously. No, Joffrey shook his head and his eyes sparkled. "My mother took me to an old man in the village when I was a child. He healed me of the scourge." "I didn't realize you were so superstitious." Liz grinned. "I'm not superstitious, I just use every opportunity to improve my life," said Joffrey thoughtfully, "regardless of their origin. Unless it's criminal, of course." Then the grandson returned to the subject of the conversation. He said that Maggie and Sami had discussed among themselves that, theoretically, Grandma's apartment was worth a lot of money, and it was not wise for her to live here alone in her old age. He said they wanted to split it up and evict Liz. That's enough. Grandmother was suddenly angry. She couldn't listen to any more bad things being said about her grandchildren. They weren't perfect people, but they were still her own blood. Suddenly Liz thought that maybe Joffrey wasn't entirely pure of spirit. Maybe he was deliberately speaking ill of his brother and sister. They're nobody to him. Maybe he's the one who wants to take over everything. Liz was so nervous that she said it all to Joffrey's face. He listened carefully. He didn't deny it, didn't take offense. He just said he was clean, he knew it, and that was enough for him. He had taken a leave of absence to look after his grandmother, and he seemed to be coping well with those duties. "But if you trust them more than you trust me, if you think I'm unnecessary, then I can leave," Joffrey said quietly, leaving the room, and that was the end of their conversation. Liz's heart was troubled because she knew she had hurt her grandson, but she was also the kind of person who wasn't used to being the first to apologize. Liz's health, meanwhile, was getting better and worse. In fact, she could get up on her own. She could walk to the bathroom, to the toilet, but sometimes she was wobbly, dizzy, and Liz realized that at this rate she would be sick until the summer, and maybe even until the fall. And even more anxious in her heart, she realized what to do. Couldn't the young people really live here with her forever? But the thought of going to some specialized boarding house for the elderly was unbearable. Gradually, insomnia was added to the malaise. Liz could lie in bed until morning, remembering that. There was a time in her life. There had been a special time in her life when she had almost chosen a different fate for herself. She had barely been a student then. She came, I remember, to one of her first classes. "Move over, please," said young Liz to a young red-haired guy who was sitting at the desk and had so sat down, so arranged his books and notebooks, that there was no room for her. "You can do it," said the boy, and he looked up at her with his piercing evil eyes, which instantly made him look like a cunning fox. "I'll let you in for a kiss." Liz's jaw dropped at the insolence, the shamelessness. She was about to angrily reprimand the scoundrel, but then he smiled in a completely disarming way. "Just kidding. Sit down, of course." And she sat down. There was no time to look for another seat in the auditorium. The professor had already arrived. Soon Liz was informed by her classmates about who the redhead was. His name was Alex Weiss, and he was the son of a fashion model and a man from abroad, or rather a businessman from Sweden. Now he lived with his mother, but he often went to visit his father. His father often gave him gifts. That's why Alex was dressed fashionably and everything imported. That's why everyone wanted to be friends with him. "He's generous," said Lillian, one of the students. "He takes girls to restaurants." "I'm not going to a restaurant with him," Liz snorted. But it turned out that Alex had plans to go to a restaurant with Liz. He invited her and also gave her flowers. She said no. Once, twice, a second time, a third time, a fourth time. "Okay," Alex said and smiled as completely conquering as he had the first time. "Then let's go to my cottage." Liz almost hit him on the head with a bouquet of tiger lilies for such insolence. But Alex saved himself by quickly explaining the situation. His father had come to visit him. He and his mother had gone to the dacha and said that Alex could call all the friends he wanted. "There are a lot of old books there," Alex said. "I thought you might be interested in naming," and he named a couple of books that took Liz's breath away. They were terribly rare editions that even Grandpa Elliot didn't have. "Okay," she said, licking her lips nervously. "So it's no big deal? Just a visit?" "I swear I'll behave like a knight." He bowed jokingly. "Do you think I don't know what knights often seek before the lady of their heart?" Liz asked with a squint. She went to the cottage. And everything was really very decent there. They grilled kebabs, went boating, sang to the guitar by the fire. The young people didn't hooliganize, and the adults didn't disturb them. In the end, they themselves needed to be alone with each other. "How can your mother do that?" sighed Liz, who suddenly found this story of love with a foreigner very romantic. "Why didn't she go to him and take you with her?" "She doesn't want to. She has grandmothers, grandfathers, aunts, and other relatives here," Alex answered. "She says that I'll finish my studies and then I'll decide where I'll live." Then Alex took his special guest to look at books. Liz's hands were trembling with excitement. It was so magical to touch old books. And it turned out that she and Alex had more common interests than it seemed before. So he too knew the legend of Princess Pelagia's gold. However, he said that he had a book in which the legend is set out in a form somewhat different from the generally accepted version. "And what is in it?" Liz asked curiously. Alex told her everything and even let her read it. In the version that Liz had known since childhood, Pelagia was the only princely daughter, and the gold she had gotten as a dowry had been cursed by another maiden. That other maiden, named Amelie, was the daughter of a goldsmith and had the misfortune to fall in love with the same guy Pelagia had been married to. Legend has it that this curse was supposed to bring misfortune to the young family, but salvation came from the fact that Pelagia and Nick, although married by the will of their parents, but over time really managed to love each other, and that's why the evil spells were not afraid of them. And the Tylers, according to this legend, were the direct descendants of this very Pelagia. However, the book in Alex's collection said something different. Pelagia was the daughter of a prince, yes, that was true. And she had a fiancé who was married off. But Amelie was not the daughter of a goldsmith, but a girl from Pelagia's maids, and her love for Nikita struck her after he had become the husband of the prince's daughter. Amelie, consumed with jealousy, angry at the fact that life is so unfair, some all, and others nothing. Sometimes, when no one saw her, she took out the casket with Pelagia's dowry and tried on her jewelry, imagining that she had become so rich and noble suddenly, as in a fairy tale. One day she was caught by Nick himself. Naturally, the poor girl was frightened. But the young master was not angry. And then Amelie tried on the jewelry again. Now Nick himself allowed her to fool around like that, and also gave her a silk handkerchief. And by the way, again, asked for payment for everything in the form of a kiss. So it went on for a long time. Until one day Pelagia suddenly found that from her chest of drawers missing ring with a ruby. And it was her favorite among all the magnificent jewelry. Naturally, they started looking for it. The ring was found in Amelie's mattress. Pelagia might have forgiven the poor girl, but she did not hold back and said everything she thought about her mistress, and also said that the young master became so cold to Pelagia because he had long loved another. At that time, by the way, Nick was not at the estate, he had gone hunting. Pelagia was furious. She said that if Amelie was so sure that Nick loved her, if she was so sure that he would save her from anywhere, if she wanted to own the gold herself. Well, you shall have it all, said Pelagia gloomily. She ordered the maid to be dressed in a silk dress, to braid pearls in her braid, and to put on her gold jewelry from the chest. And then she ordered her to take her into the forest and there to be chained to a tree, to leave her for the wolves to prey on. Let it be so, said Pelagia, looking at the unfortunate victim from the height of her raven mare, on which she sat in a lady's saddle of scarlet morocco. If Nick finds you, I will not interfere with your happiness. Run to the ends of the earth with him, and take the gold. I don't want it. It'll be yours. Maybe it'll bring you happiness. But if the wolves find you before, well then, that's your fate. And Pelagia and her faithful servants rode off. Amelie stayed in the thicket of the forest, and soon she heard the howling of wolves. She did not know that Nick was not so far away. He was hunting, and just chased one wolf. It was a huge old beast. Nick and his friends had already killed its family, a she-wolf and her cubs, and now he was eager to get the skin of the beast. Nick had already imagined how he would dress it better and throw it at the feet of his Amelie. And it so happened that Nick's horse got ahead, and his companions, also dashing hunters, lagged behind. And then, suddenly Nick flew into the clearing. One awkward step, it was a hole, a burrow of some beast met, and the horse flew, fell down, the rider over his head tumbled. And then Nick, barely rising, saw what was happening in the clearing. He saw Amelie standing by a tree, and a wolf that stood on its hind legs and opened its huge, toothy maw, breathing in her face. Nick looked behind him for his bow and arrow, but both remained on the saddle and the horse. He had run away because he was afraid of the wolf. Nick reached for his belt. There should have been a dagger there, but he remembered that he had lost it in the battle with the she-wolf, and he realized that he was unarmed. "Don't touch her," Nick shouted, as if the wolf could understand human speech. "Let go of my beloved, and then I'll let you go." The beast clamped his ears, growled muffled, and then suddenly rushed into the thicket. Nick rushed to the girl. He untangled the ropes, patted her white cheeks, and brought her to her senses. Amelie told him everything. "Now you have nothing more to fear," said Nick. "Let's go out of the woods and then decide how to proceed." And they walked slowly. They thought that they were about to meet Nick's companions, but the forest was silent, as if it had all died out. The sun, meanwhile, was waning towards sunset, but before its disk touched the horizon, the edge of the forest appeared. Nick, with a joyful cry, rushed towards it. Just for a moment he took his hand away from Amelie's hand. Just for a moment he left it behind his back. There was a terrible cry. Nick turned around and saw that Amelie was lying on the ground, and above her standing the same wolf. The man and the predator looked into each other's eyes. And suddenly Nick's head was pierced by a sharp pain. A foreign, heavy, rumbling like thunder voice broke into it, which said, "You did not spare my beloved, my little ones. So why should I spare yours?" A moment later, the wolf took a powerful leap and disappeared into the forest. Nick rushed to his beloved, but Amelie was no longer breathing. And then the other hunters arrived. There were shouts, noise. But how much that wolf was not looking for, and could not find a single trace of it, as if through the ground fell through. Nick returned to his lawful wedded wife. He told her everything. "I will continue to be your husband," he said, and threw at her feet jewelry, which he took off Amelie. "But I'm afraid our bloodline is now cursed." Legend had it that the jewelry that had been preserved for posterity since Pelagia's time did not always bring misfortune to everyone. But sometimes it happened that they seemed to come to life. That is, the old curse came to life. And then families were destroyed because of the gold, and relatives began to fight among themselves like hungry wolves. Liz was very impressed with this version of the legend. It was much darker, and, despite all the folktale elements, somehow it even seemed more realistic. And since that day, Liz suddenly realized that she felt sympathy for Alex, and that sympathy soon turned into love. Except that love never had a chance. Because one day Alex announced that he had made a decision he was going to his father. It's better that way. "What about me?" Liz asked. "What if I ask you to stay?" "You're too young," he replied with a chuckle. "But we're about the same age," she objected indignantly. "You don't understand," Alex sighed. "You're a nice girl, Liz, but you and I, it's not going to work out. But you know what? Let me tell you something. I'll always be a good friend to you, even 100 years from now." "I'll need you in 100 years, old grandfather," Liz grumbled. Contrary to her own expectations, for some reason she didn't feel pain at the refusal, but only disappointment and some light sadness, as if this refusal was destined by fate itself. Alex said that he would always and forever remain her friend, and that if one day in her life there would be hard times, she could turn to him. And he even said that he would bequeath the same to his children, that they should consider Liz their friend, and if Alex was no longer in the world, that they would help her if she needed it. Liz said she only wanted Alex to leave her alone forever. But then, before he left, she added that it was okay. Maybe she would see him again someday. "I'm not coming for help," Liz said. "I'm inviting you to my wedding, so you can see how happy I've become." Liz had such big, bright plans for her life. But she didn't invite Alex to the wedding. She thought, why would she? Why bring up the past? They were so young and stupid, talking such nonsense. Some stupid oaths he'd made up about helping her. That's for legends and stories, not for real life. And then, the day after her wedding, Liz hid the sheet with Alex's address and phone number far away, at the bottom of the box where the gold was kept. Liz couldn't understand why she remembered that particular part of her life. And then she realized, because she couldn't help but wonder how things would have turned out if Alex had become her husband then, if he hadn't rejected her. Would she probably have a different daughter, not Christy, and different grandchildren? Maybe she would be sitting on a veranda somewhere in Sweden, surrounded by a large, friendly family and drinking tea, looking at the blossoming garden. And now what's here? Or, no matter how you spin it, you can't escape your fate. Some more time passed, and Liz began to notice that she was feeling better. Slowly, little by little, but she felt better. Now she could go out to the entrance and sit on the bench. But there were other grandmothers sitting there, and she had nothing to talk to them about, because they all talked about their own things, about medicines, prices in stores, and she, Liz, was not interested in such things. But she, Liz, at least had some fun sitting like that. And then one day at home, a terrible thing happened. It all started with Sami coming home drunk. In fact, Liz had sent her grandchildren to the store to buy something for the festive table. Her birthday was approaching, and the old lady wanted to celebrate it modestly. But as it happened, Joffrey, who had left home earlier, he had gone to the other side of town to buy medicine for his grandmother. When he came back, he was furious. He started telling off his brother and sister. There was a fight, and then they all fought. And Liz was sure that Joffrey had started it. She'd yelled at him too, telling him to be more tolerant of his relatives. Tolerant? Joffrey was so indignant and tense that his face was even blotchy. "What kind of people are they, Grandma? They should be thrown out." "Oh, we're talking," Maggie said with her arms at her sides. "You want to get your own place, don't you?" "What do you mean?" Liz didn't understand. And then it was explained to her. It turned out that Joffrey had gone to the lawyers to consult. He wanted to know if it was possible to arrange it so that Liz could write a gift quickly, just. Anyway, he wanted her to give him the apartment. Grandmother Joffrey sighed. "I can explain everything, really. You've got it all wrong. I just want to make sure. To keep you safe. If you gave me the apartment, they," he said, pointing his finger at his brother and sister, "wouldn't be able to get it. They wouldn't be able to get it. And you would continue to live here in complete safety." And he also found out about the nursing home. Liz almost fainted at these words. She hadn't expected such treachery from the man she had thought for years to be better than her own grandchildren. Grandmother Joffrey stepped toward her, but Liz recoiled. I didn't ask about a nursing home, but about a clinic, a vacation home, so that you could improve your health and then. That's it. That's it. Get away from me. Liz was hysterical. What the hell are you thinking? No, you're not my grandson anymore. Maggie, granddaughter, take me to bed. I don't feel well. Joffrey tried to explain that his intentions were purest, that he just wanted to keep Liz safe from people who really wanted to hurt her. Except she didn't listen to him. She wailed, she cried. And then she told Joffrey in a harsh, scathing voice that she renounced him, that he was a stranger to her, and that she was sorry that her daughter, Christy, had been a good stepmother to such a monster for so many years. Joffrey listened attentively and silently. He didn't try to object. He didn't try to defend himself or justify himself in any other way. And Liz took it all as a confirmation of his guilt. "Get out of my house," she said at the end. And the grandson didn't leave. He just packed up and left. Silently, without saying goodbye. Liz cried bitterly. Maggie fussed with her heart drops. Sami had said it was for the best, that everything would be all right now. What Liz didn't see was that her grandson and granddaughter looked at each other for a moment, and their faces contorted into a wicked grin. In the evening, Liz felt sick at heart and had to call an ambulance. The doctors, who had been briefed on the situation very roughly and one-sidedly, said that of course stress at that age is extremely harmful to the body, so the old lady just needed to rest. And for a few days, the sick Liz spent like in a dream. And then something else happened. That evening, it was raining outside the window. It seemed like a flood. There was thunder. All in all, it was a very unfavorable weather atmosphere. An hour ago, she had asked Maggie to make her some herbal remedies for insomnia, but her granddaughter had not yet fulfilled her grandmother's wish. And Liz had no idea why Sami had returned drunk again. Apparently, Maggie was having a talk with him now, as voices could be heard coming from the kitchen. Liz climbed out of bed. Overcome with weakness, she wanted a cup of tea. She could use a snack, like a cheese sandwich. But she did not dare to call Maggie again. She would rather let her brother take care of him. She must save the boy, lest he should get into this trouble. And she, Liz, would get there by herself. Nothing would happen to her. Noiselessly, the old woman left her room and moved, holding on to the wall, into the kitchen. She could hear the voices clearly now. It was only a short distance from the door to the kitchen, but then Liz froze, because strange words came to her ears. "I'm sick of the old one," Maggie said. Cleaning her up, washing her. "She stinks. I'm tired. All day long, I'm tied up at home like a leash. And I'm still young. I want to live." "Yes, we've been sitting here too long," said Sami with a grin. "Good thing that idiot left. I thought he would ruin everything." "What are we going to do?" asked the granddaughter. "The old woman's gold should be divided, and she should be taken to the city dump," said Sami. "No, you imagine how much gold there will be there, eh?" "To the dump." Maggie repeated after her brother thoughtfully. "You don't mean that literally, do you?" "And who knows me?" Sami chuckled. "Well, maybe not to the dump, but to a shelter. There are free do not know, and I don't want to pay." "I'm sick of everything," said Maggie. "I thought my grandmother would give me something to eat. Have you seen how many old books and clothes there are? What's the use? They're all junk. They should be taken to the dump. And sell the apartment." Sami banged his fist. "Fool," said Maggie. "Maybe there's something antique. Sometimes they pay big money for such things." "The rich get fat," Sami replied. Something rumbled and clinked in the kitchen, as if they were pouring a drink from a bottle. It was about time that idiot was kicked out by his grandmother. He wanted to be the first to get a piece. "Want some?" Poor Maggie said. "No, I don't think he wanted to steal. He probably wanted to save the old woman. What an idiot. Who the hell is he?" "Nothing," Sami chuckled. "She kicked him out. Now he won't save her. Now we'll decide everything by ourselves. That's enough. The old woman has lived and lived. It's time for us to get everything. And the gold is the most important. Maybe it's worth $1 million. What do you think?" Liz didn't remember how, but she walked quietly back. She closed the door and lay on the bed, stretched out on her back, her arms folded across her chest. She heard her heart thudding knock, knock, knock. knock, 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 knock beneath her hands, and she thought it would stop once. And it would stop now. What she heard was like a forest fire that consumes the young growth. It was like a tub of water being splashed on a freshly painted canvas, and it washed away all the colors. Liz's world turned upside down, back and forth, spinning and falling somewhere. The old woman couldn't get it into her head. Was this happening to her? Was it not a terrible dream? Or maybe it was really a dream? Maybe she fell asleep to a program that tells about how soulless and heartless sometimes children and grandchildren are, and that's how she dreamed it. How much time had passed, Liz didn't know. But judging by the way the moon moved across the sky and peered through the window with its ghostly disk, it was already night. The door opened and a dark silhouette peered into the dark room. Liz had turned off the lights when she returned. "Grandma, are you asleep?" the silhouette asked in Maggie's voice. Liz held her breath, hiding on the bunk, pretending to sleep, because she knew for sure that if she said a word or glanced at it now, it would be the end. Maggie would realize that she'd heard everything. And then what would happen to her? What would they do to her? The morning of the next day was clear and sunny. The weather was so sunny that one could think that the universe itself was smiling at you, looking in the window. So stop sulking. Get up. Live life to the fullest. But this morning seemed just black to Liz. She waited with fear for Maggie to look in on her, and when her granddaughter came, Liz was shaking every moment. What if she realized from her eyes that she knew everything? But Maggie didn't seem to know anything. She fed Liz with semolina porridge on water as usual, because she was on a diet, gave her tea, gave her another piece of bread, and said she was going to go to the store. She added about her brother, saying that Sami had gone to see if there was any need for laborers at the market. "I can't live on your pension alone," Maggie sighed, pretending to be sad. "I don't know how we're going to get by." "I'm almost well now," granddaughter Liz smiled shyly, her lips trembling. "Thank you, my darlings, for helping me to get back on my feet. You'll soon be able to come home. I'm used to being on my own for years." "What are you talking nonsense, grandmother?" Maggie laughed, but her eyes were not merry and cold. "This is our home. We are, after all, your heirs." "No, grandmother," Maggie wagged her finger at her. "We're not going anywhere from you now. We're not going anywhere. We're going to keep a close eye on you." "Well, I'm off. I'm young. I have to be on time for everything." Liz was as quiet as a mouse until Maggie packed up and left the house. When the key clicked in the lock, the old woman exhaled long and hard. Oh, how she wanted to feel sorry for herself, to sit and cry. But I realized, this is not the case. She had to hurry. She had to save herself before her grandson and granddaughter threw away the Tyler family's legacy. Rising carefully, Liz reached the closet, pulled up a chair. Oh, scary. At her age, falling from such a height could kill you. But her body didn't let her down, and so Liz took a large shoebox from the top of the closet. It was junk, but it held what was dearer to her than anything else in the world: Princess Pelagia's gold. She untangled the old shawls and handkerchiefs that wrapped the carved wooden chest. It had been a long, long time since she had looked in it. Perhaps 5 years already. And why would she do that? Lately, contact with the family history had been painful, stirring up unnecessary memories, making her question the decisions she'd once made. Liz knew there were priceless treasures under the lid, and a notebook with the address and phone number of a man she'd sworn she'd never ask for help. And actually, this is all so silly. Well, really. Alex, then Liz realized she had to call. She had to call. Slowly, tautly, the lid lifted with the creak of ancient wood. Liz knew what she must see: the dull glow of gold in the midday sun. But what appeared before her? The old woman froze, her eyes rounded. Her heart skipped a beat. No, it was impossible. It couldn't be. But the sight did not lie, and she reached into the casket with a trembling hand and took out something she had not expected to find. Not that Joffrey was prepared for such a development, but he sensed that if Granny knew what he was up to, she wouldn't give him a hard time. Because Liz, unfortunately, is too kind and somewhat naive in a person who is in the captivity of his own illusions. Therefore, Joffrey only had to be extremely careful. But at some point, things didn't go according to plan, and he, damn it, was not even allowed to explain himself normally with his grandmother. He wanted to lash out at the two vultures who had the nerve to call themselves Grandma Liz's grandson and granddaughter, but he didn't. Because he realized that this time there would be no victory on his side. And in order to be able to continue to do everything normally, and not to ruin the relationship with his grandmother under the influence of others, Geoffrey decided to leave her house. Just for a while, just for a day or two. And then, it was only necessary to buy time, when the vultures' damned vultures would not be in the apartment and could talk to his grandmother about everything. That was Geoffrey's plan. And it wasn't bad at all. The guy stood at the bus stop under its iron visor and waited for the bus. While he was waiting for transportation, he went to the internet via smartphone and renewed the lease of a daily apartment, which he had already looked for a long time because it was getting harder and harder to live in an apartment. And Geoffrey decided that he would live there first, and then he would probably rent an apartment for a longer period of time because he would have to stay in the city for his grandmother's business. Geoffrey was heartily grateful to the university authorities, who, having heard about his family's circumstances, granted him a leave of absence without any criticism or reproach. Raising the collar of his jacket, it was pouring rain. Geoffrey stretched his neck, looking for the bus. And then, everything happened in a flash. Just one car at the crossroads suddenly lost control, probably because of the wet road, or maybe something happened to the brakes, but it was suddenly carried to the side. People from the bus stop scattered. Geoffrey, immersed in his thoughts, hesitated. And then there was a blow, a flash of deafening pain and darkness. "Am I all right?" was the first thing Geoffrey asked when he woke up. And he asked it for two reasons. First, there was no pain in his body, which was naturally suspicious after such a collision. And second, there was a marvelous golden-haired creature leaning over him, who could easily be mistaken for a guide to a better world. Like those who are dying to lead through the tunnel to the eternal light. Alive and not even broken, which is amazing, said a gruff voice. And the marvelous creature was displaced by a bearded man in a hospital gown. The doctor, and it was he, introduced himself to Harry and told him that Geoffrey had been lucky to get away with a few bruises and a suspected concussion. All he had to do was not cross the road at a red light. What? Geoffrey's eyes widened. The car lost control. No, the doctor frowned. Don't you start laying blame on me. Eyewitnesses saw you step into the roadway thinking about something. They called out to you, but you ran like a rhinoceros right into the car, which did lose control a little. Yeah, Geoffrey squirmed guiltily against the cushions, remembering that he'd been so absorbed in thought that he'd taken a careless step forward. So, if it hadn't been for my own stupidity, it wouldn't have hit me, maybe. And who is this? He asked and wanted to stretch his neck. Because the broad shoulders of the doctor blocked the golden-haired woman, but immediately shrieked from the shooting pain in his neck. The one you scared to death, replied the girl. And the perpetrator of the incident, apparently. What? Geoffrey smiled weakly. No, they say it was my own fault, said the girl. And I'm to blame, said the girl. I should have minimized speed in the rain, but I just did not expect. So don't argue now, okay? Gennady said sternly. Why did I allow you to see the patient at all? In general, will you write a claim for damage to health? The guilty party is ready to pay for all treatment and also compensation for moral damage. The girl nodded hastily. But the last thing Geoffrey could think about now was money. No one else was hurt, the girl said. Well, just my car had hit a concrete fence. Are you all right? Shrieked Geoffrey. As you can see, she smiled charmingly. The airbag didn't fail. Well, here's my phone. With these words, she put a sheet on the bedside table. I'll be in touch. I won't run away. And here's one more thing. She dug into her purse and pulled out a wad of bills. I withdrew it from the nearest ATM. It's here, near the hospital. I keep the rest at home, in cash. I'll bring it all back by tonight. Wait a minute, Geoffrey squinted, his head spinning as if he'd been forced on a merry-go-round for hours on end. What's your name? Larry replied, a beautiful woman with a golden mane of curly hair who looked to be in her early 20s. And now, please, the visiting hours are all ready. Gennady got into the conversation again. You can come back later. And right now the young man needs rest and I must tell him about his condition. Further necessary observation, treatment. Yes, of course. Larry's making a fuss. Get well and... Forgive me, I'm sorry, it's very just terrible, she added from the doorway. Geoffrey smiled weakly at her. He didn't feel sick and broken. On the contrary, light as a cloud. Don't get too excited, the doctor warned. Soon the effect of drugs will go down and I'll feel every bone. But don't worry, we'll find you some weaker painkillers. In the meantime, let's talk about this. Who are your contacts? No, said Geoffrey. I'm from out of town. My father's there, but he won't be able to come for sure. That's too bad, the doctor shook his head. Someone has to take care of you. You'll be out of the hospital soon. I'm renting an apartment, Geoffrey went on. I was thinking of renting for a long time. I have a grandmother in town. That's great. We'll let my grandmother know. No, exclaimed the boy, and seeing how the doctor's eyebrows went up, explained. She can't worry, she's sick herself and there's no point anyway. She and I, we had a very big quarrel. Would you like me to share an observation as a doctor who's been here for 20 years? No matter how much relatives fight, usually when someone goes to the hospital, all the fuss and misunderstandings go away. Relatives, you know, usually do not abandon. Well, all right, Geoffrey sighed. But let's do it tomorrow already. Grandma, she thinks I'm just sitting in my apartment anyway, and she's not going to come looking for me today. Liz felt like a complete fool, an idiot, as she dialed that very phone number. She was well aware of how much time had passed and that it could have been changed 100 times already. And anyway, in the age of digital technology, it was reasonable to assume that instead of a landline phone, everyone was using a cell phone, which meant that the only way to get in touch with Alex, if he was still alive at all, would be to send a letter. And he might not have lived at that address for decades, and how long that letter would take. And yet, Liz dialed the number. You old fool, she told herself after the 6th ringtone, but the receiver was suddenly picked up. They answered in English, and Liz's mind was so out of foreign language it was like a foreign language. The other end asked, "Who is this?" and probably would have hung up, thinking it was a prank call, but then Liz finally pulled herself together and asked Alex. "Who is it?" they asked. "You see, Grandpa's not very well." "But is he sane?" Liz blurted out, suddenly afraid that Alex might, theoretically, be suffering from dementia. Liz, almost crying, began to apologize and say that she was just an old acquaintance of his, and she didn't think that she would catch him after so many years, and she was very, very sorry for the indelicacy, but if you can, tell him that it's Lizonka calling, the same one who once visited him at his dacha. "All right," said a man's voice on the other side, uncertainly. "I'll ask my grandfather now." "Wait, okay?" Liz thanked Mikhail, the man who had introduced himself as Alex's son, and waited. Her heart was beating fast and it seemed too heavy. Is he going to tell her something? And in general, why is she calling him? What does he recognize? It's time an old man? Can she, an old woman from his distant past, help her now? He lives in another country. This is ridiculous. No, Liz thought she should end the call now, tear the sheet with the number, and address to shreds, forget the whole thing and try to. Liz? The voice she heard was exactly as she remembered it, and for a split second the past and the future seemed to blend together. "Alex," Liz breathed out. You're alive." Liz couldn't take it anymore, and she started to cry. "Okay, first of all, calm down." His voice was as stern as it was soothing. "I suppose you didn't call me for the first and only time after all these years to talk about Silver Age poetry. Tell me what happened, and we'll figure out what to do next." Geoffrey hated being sick. It came from his childhood when his father, under the influence of his neighbor Aunt Ducia, a great admirer of folk medicine, had treated his flu with steam from a pot of potatoes and some disgusting fat dissolved in hot milk. And so, although the hospital was clean and even fed good food, and the neighbors on the ward were quiet and decent, and although the nurse was young and cheerful, but from the face of Geoffrey still did not go sour, dissatisfied with everything in the world Mina. Naturally, it was necessary to settle all the formalities that he had no claims to Larry. By the way, they talked not only about the business topic, but also about everything. It turned out that Larry was born and raised in this city and once, Almost 15 years ago, her parents, who had previously lived in Sweden, moved here because the family had roots here. When she learned that Joffrey was studying to be a jeweler, Laurie laughed and said it was a funny coincidence, almost because she had already studied to be a geologist and dreamed of devoting her life to precious and ornamental stones. "Have you got a boyfriend?" Joffrey suddenly blurted out. "You ask too many questions for someone I hit with a car." Laurie wagged her finger at him, and then suddenly got serious and answered. "No. And I'm not ready for a relationship yet. Love. It's too complicated. First you need to stand firmly on your feet, to live for yourself. And then already let another person into your life." "That makes sense," Joffrey nodded, his hair reddening. "I asked you that, by the way, without thinking. I'm not hitting on you. Look, I'm getting discharged tomorrow," he sighed. "On the daily I still prolonged, I'll lie there. Then I'll look at other apartments, well, to rent for a long time. In general, thank you for offering moral compensation and all that, but I cannot agree to it. Thank you for giving me more money for treatment. And so, my father will send me. I'm fine, I'll hold out. But he will send in 3 days only. I've already paid for the apartment for these days. In general." Joffrey again sighed. "Honestly, I have only 500 rubles in my wallet. Can you pay for a cab to get me to my apartment? I'm afraid I'll have a hard time taking public transportation. My back hurts." "I'll drive you," she said, and hastily, noticing how Joffrey's eyes rounded, added, "Not me, but my father. He can take you in the car. I won't drive again for a while, I'm afraid. Also, I've been thinking. Well, since you're a little short on money then. You know, my dad's at the country house. An old country house, built in the 50s or even earlier. Maybe. Will you stay with us? Well, while you're recovering. Fresh air. And there's no worries, my dad has a woman working there. Tina's name is Tina. She's a great maid and cook. Anyway, I'm sorry I'm rambling, it's the first time it's happened. And with a car and a man. It's the first time." Joffrey blurted out and then stopped talking, because the joke was stupid, inappropriate, and not about anything. Laurie looked at him in confusion too, and then for some reason they laughed together. "You agree, Guy," came the voice of a neighbor in the ward, 40-year-old metallurgist, who went to the hospital with an industrial injury. If in my 20s such a girl offered me a visit, I would fly like a dove if I didn't go." Joffrey sighed. Maybe. It really wasn't such a bad option, was it? It had been a few days since he'd left his grandmother's apartment, by the way, and he thought that Liz must have cooled down enough to listen to him. And they had to talk. Judging by the way the half-brother and sister were behaving, it was urgent to rescue Grandma from their company. With Larry agreed that she would pick him up the next day in the morning. That evening, however, Joffrey dialed Liz's number. He waited. He called back. But the caller was unavailable. His heart felt uneasy, and he dialed Maggie's number. She seemed a little more human to him than Sami's brother. "She's not here." Maggie blurted out with an intonation that betrayed confusion, indignation, and deep drunkenness. "She's gone, the old fool." "Where?" asked Joffrey. "How should I know?" Maggie shrieked. "We caught her in the driveway. She got in the car with some guy, a man in a suit, and said that she was going on vacation. And we. She said that she was tired and needed to think about everything. That man is a bore, said that we do not think." "How did he say?" "Ah, intrigue. No, can you imagine?" Joffrey had no idea. Rubbing the bridge of his nose nervously, he didn't know what to think. Who and where could quiet, timid Grandma Liz have gone? What if, exhausted by the bad company of her grandchildren, she'd gotten involved with some kind of crook, cult, black realtor? Joffrey felt a pang of guilt. He was good, too. He should have realized what rotten people his brother and sister were, and he should have been more decisive, should have talked to Liz instead of not scheming himself. By the way, Maggie continued in a stuttering voice. "What's the word, intrigue, huh?" "I have no idea," Joffrey smirked, though of course he knew the meaning of the word perfectly well. "Bye, then," and he ended the conversation. He was in a state of shock. Where could Grandma Liz have gone? And with whom? Why wasn't she answering his calls? In fact, Joffrey realized with his mind that she had probably not yet discovered that something very important to her was missing, her main jewel, namely gold. Yes, Joffrey had left his grandmother's apartment for a reason. A couple of days before Liz had thrown him out in a scandal, he had taken advantage of her absence. She had been with Maggie and Sami at the clinic to go into her room, and knowing perfectly well where the treasure chest had been kept all these years, had taken it out. He opened it, put the gold in a box, and put it in his inconspicuous sports traveling bag. In place, that is, at the bottom of the chest, put a note in which he explained everything as it is. "Mole, I'm taking this, grandmother, to save for you, because your grandchildren relatives are already thinking about how to divide it." In general, Joffrey, when all this was arranged, hoped that he would be able to personally with his grandmother to talk about all this before she noticed the disappearance of gold jewelry. After all, he knew for a fact that she had not touched them for years, and therefore theoretically she should not have noticed that they were missing. But anything could have happened. And now Joffrey wondered, and if she had found out that they were missing, how had she reacted? Did she believe what he said in the note? Just words, with no proof that he was right? Or did she curse him as a dishonorable thief? Or maybe Granny had already filed a complaint against him. But Joffrey thought if the latter was true, they would probably have found him in the hospital by now and come to him here. So where was the truth? And who the hell had taken his grandmother away, and where? On the day he was discharged from the hospital, Joffrey was worried sick. His own consent seemed to him a rash folly. After all, he hardly knew Larry at all, and he had already accepted an invitation to visit her at home. And not even at home, but at her country cottage. But on the other hand, why would she plot something evil against him? It's more like she's trying to make it up to him for hitting him with her car. The day he was discharged from the hospital, Larry and her father came to pick him up. Vincent, a solid-looking man in a suit, shook Joffrey's hand and said he sympathized with him and was grateful that he had agreed to a peaceful resolution to the whole thing. "Yes, it was nothing," replied Joffrey with a look as if his cars were being hit on a weekly and regular basis. From the hospital, they went first to a rented apartment. They had to pack their things, which, fortunately, were few. Unnoticed by his new acquaintances, Joffrey poked his hand into the bag with the gold. The box with it seemed to be still inside. The jewelry rustled if the bag was shaken. On the way to the cottage, we got to talking to Vincent. It turned out that he is engaged in honey business. He said that he owns several apiaries, supplies bee products to many stores, and in general does not regret that he settled here. Because here is his real home. Here has felt some special, almost mystical connection with the ancestors. "My father is thinking of coming here this year," too, Vincent said, "for a visit. I don't want to disturb. Well, I mean, it's a family atmosphere, and here's a stranger." "It's all right," Vincent smiled, "but I must warn you. Besides me and Tina and you, there will be one other person living at the cottage. A pensioner, an old acquaintance of my father's." "That's all right," said Joffrey. "I have a grandmother myself." "Larry said you had a fight with her?" Vincent grinned. "Generational differences?" "Something like that," Joffrey said, not wanting to be privy to any personal squabbles. "Family circumstances," he said, staring thoughtfully out the window at the summer scenery and planning how to look for Granny, because of course he couldn't leave it at that. Wow. That was all Joffrey could say when the cottage appeared in front of them, when they drove through the pine grove. At first sight it was clear it was an unusual place, which seemed to exist in some detachment from the surrounding, mundane world. The two-storied building reminded of a harem, as it is often depicted in Russian fairy tales, but at the same time it was felt that everything here was thought out for the comfort, modern convenience of the inhabitants. The lower floor was flanked by a veranda, partly glazed, partly open, with a railing and columns covered with skillful carvings and covered with some curly and lushly blooming plants. "Welcome," Vincent smiled as Joffrey got out of the car. "Here's our family, and here's our guest." From the porch of the house came a short, plump, but clearly full of vitality woman of about 50, dressed in a brightly colored dress. "You are, of course, Joffrey," she smiled broadly at the boy, introduced herself as Tina, and taking him firmly under her arm and even hugging him around the waist, led him toward the house. "I'll make you some tea now. How do you feel about raspberry jam? I made a pie with it. There's also fish pie. And soup. Cabbage salad with carrots and apple. Oh, careful, the step is sagging here, it should be fixed. Don't worry, I've prepared a bedroom for you downstairs." You're in no condition to run up and down stairs, are you? Tina was still talking, and Joffrey couldn't get a word in edgewise. Vincent and Larry laughed at the encounter. Vincent carried Joffrey's bags into his room, and Larry joined Tina in talking about the cottage and its surroundings. "And now we have a surprise for you," Vincent said abruptly, as the little group made their way to what he said was the veranda at the back of the house, where the tea table was set. A surprise? It wasn't that Joffrey didn't like surprises, but he'd never been spoiled with them in his life, and he hadn't realized what there might be. And then when he stepped out onto the veranda and saw who was standing in front of him, he was speechless. "Grandma?" Liz smiled at her grandson and opened her arms to him, and he, still not too sure of the reality of the surrounding reality, stepped towards her. Grandma, but what are you doing here? And you?" Joffrey swallowed hard and looked into the old woman's eyes. They were warm, tender. "Have you forgiven me, Grandma?" "How could I not, grandson?" she said, and stroked his head, ruffling his already unruly hair. "I think you have a lot of questions." Joffrey nodded, but before he could say a word, Tina intervened, saying that it was best not to eat on an empty stomach, and that everyone should sit down and she would serve the pies and everything. Joffrey talked himself into taking his time, if only out of respect for the owners of the house, whose identity he was now much more concerned about, and indeed drank a cup of tea, ate a little something. And then finally Liz spoke. And to begin with, she spoke briefly about how she had met Alex in her youth, how fate had divided them, and how then, lo and behold, just the other day she had realized it was time to turn to him. It turned out that Alex couldn't help her so quickly. If he wanted to, he was far away vacationing at a resort, but he could entrust the care of an old friend to his son Vincent. "I almost went crazy when I saw him." Liz smiled. "He looks just like his father when he was young. Oh, if I weren't so old, I'd be madly in love," she said, and laughed. Liz hastened to tell Joffrey that she had overheard the whole sordid, dirty conversation between her blood grandson and granddaughter, which had opened her eyes to many things. And then, when she read Joffrey's note, a lot of things came together for her. "You know, the day after I called Alex, I went to the clinic with Sami," Liz said, "and when I got home, I saw that my room had been turned upside down. Maggie said she wanted to tidy up my room, and her eyes were running around. I knew right away it wasn't true. She's never been used to cleanliness or order, and the way everything was torn through, I realized what she really wanted. She was looking for gold." And then, a few days later, Liz said, growing sad, "Sami came to me. He had been drinking heavily. He started asking me how I was, how old I was, had I already written a will for my grandchildren. I told him to stop saying such things, but he got angry. Believe me, he pushed me so hard that I fell. What a bastard." Joffrey almost jumped up from the table, as if he were going to run to his brother to punch him in the face. Maggie calmed him down. Liz continued. "I was shaking all night. I had a chair against the door, but if they'd wanted to break in, the chair wouldn't have stopped them. In the morning, Sami apologized. Maggie begged for her brother. Well, I pretended that everything was fine, that I didn't hold a grudge. I really don't hold a grudge," Liz shrugged. "What good is anger? It just eats away at your soul like rust. I decided I couldn't stay in my own house with them anymore. And then Alex talked it over with his son, and Vincent offered me a place to stay while everything was sorted out. Grandma, I always knew." Joffrey started to speak fervently, but then, pulling himself together, he continued more calmly. "I always thought Maggie and Sami weren't the most decent people. I'm sorry." "It's all right," Liz sighed. "Life happens. I'm lucky to have one grandson. A real one."